Well, I don't really know why, and probably other people can say more about it. I think part of it was there was a very strong reaction to the novel in Europe and in England, and I think that some people were sort of frightened by that. And one of the things I'd heard was that the critics would auto-censor, as they said, and just not review it. I was surprised because I think of France as always being very daring in terms of the literature that it's published, and actually a leader in terms of publishing very complicated, very difficult books. So that was, you know, upsetting. I'm so thrilled that it's out now, and I think more importantly, the subject matter of the book is as relevant or more relevant now. When it first came out, people sort of said, oh, this is something that we don't talk about, that doesn't really happen. And as we see all over the world, the subject of you know, the abuse of children is in every newspaper, in every country, in every culture. And my feeling is always, until we find a way of talking about it, we won't find a way of stopping it. So as difficult as the material is, and it's a very difficult book, I wanted to sort of prompt that discussion. Absolutely, and I think it's, you know, I think part of why the abuse of children has continued and does continue is because we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to take any responsibility, and I think people who obviously, the majority of people obviously don't hurt children, but it is the people who don't hurt children who have to stop it from happening. And there's a lot of shame associated with it, and we don't, no society really deals well with that, and having to recognize that, and especially when it happens in churches and in very places that are very venerable and that we, you know, think of as sacred. I mean, it's a very difficult idea. Right. Well, and in this book in particular, The End of Alice is very, for lack of a better word, it's very direct, because the character speaking to you is the man who's committed these crimes. And at the same time, the interesting thing for me as a writer was how to write about somebody who does things that are very, what we think of as inhuman, but he is a human, and to find the humanity in that. And that's one of the challenges of it. You know, I think it's interesting because we say, like in fiction, do we want to read something that's so upsetting and difficult? But if you look at whether we're reading books about philosophy or politics or history, the things that move us and change us are things that are challenging. I mean, it's not, you know, I don't want to just read a book and be entertained. I want to be made to think and made to consider, you know, larger ideas.
On a découvert Amy avec ce livre va vous sauver la vie. Ensuite, nous avons continué avec The Mistress Doctor, traduit par Le Sens de la famille. Et l'agent de l'auteur nous a à ce moment-là m'a alerté sur le fait qu'existait une version déjà traduite en français de ce livre The End of Alice, la fin d'Alice, que je ne connaissais pas à l'époque et que donc j'ai découvert à ce moment-là en français. Je dois quand même avouer que c'est quand même une des premières fois de ma vie que j'ai été très contente qu'il existe une version française du texte, parce que le texte utile était en anglais seul. Je propose, moi, acte sud, à mon directeur éditorial Bertrand Pille, des textes, mais j'ai été assez soulagée de pouvoir lui donner un texte en français pour ne pas engager la maison dans la publication d'un texte que moi, je reconnaissais à tous égards comme étant une nécessité de publication, mais dont le sujet, moi aussi, sans tomber dans une pruderie ou une autocensure quelconque, dit bon, il faut que quand même tout le monde sache vers quoi on va, parce qu'il y a une responsabilité de l'éditeur par rapport à ce qu'il publie, et j'avais besoin d'un aval, j'avais besoin qu'on soit plusieurs Ça m'a été d'un grand secours que cette traduction existe pour être sûre que je ne serais pas seule à, finalement, oui, peut-être que j'ouvrais un parapluie, à porter la responsabilité de mettre, de publier ce livre-là, c'est-à-dire de le mettre à la disposition du public, hein, d'où le nom, publier, ça veut vraiment dire ça, et en même temps, c'était une nécessité absolue que de le faire. C'est un texte qui, moi, que j'ai considéré comme immédiatement, enfin ce sont des mots qu'on faut employer, je sais, avec précaution, mais comme un chef-d'œuvre. Au sens, un peu le chef-d'œuvre des compagnons, quoi, enfin, c'est-à-dire un objet littéraire qui m'a paru s'imposer souverainement. Enfin, c'est un texte souverain, c'est-à-dire qui est là dans son... Alors, qui est à prendre ou à laisser. Et moi, j'aime beaucoup la littérature qui est à prendre ou à laisser. Je l'ai lu en anglais, et c'est là que d'ailleurs j'ai constaté que la traduction initiale, sans lisser le texte, mais ne rendait pas tout à fait justice à la voix VOX de l'auteur, et que donc on a ensuite attendu un peu pour faire réviser un peu le texte, en accord avec le traducteur initial, dont c'était une des premières traductions, et avec qui ça s'est très bien passé. Il est âpre quand même, il y a une âpreté dans la langue, il y a un son, il y a un bruit de la langue qui n'était pas tout à fait restitué, peut-être suffisamment, en tout cas dans la première version. A.M Homes est une femme qui se met dans la peau d'un pédophile, c'est-à-dire qu'elle regarde le désir à la fois du point de vue de l'homme, du point de vue de la femme, qu'elle assure comme ça une espèce de jonction. Pour moi, c'est un livre sur le mal, sur le désir, sur les profondeurs de l'âme. C'est un livre d'exploration des gouffres, et il y a justement dès lors plus aucune raison de s'inquiéter de la dimension peut-être gênante, perturbante du texte, sauf à effectivement rabattre la lecture du côté du seul sujet et de vouloir véritablement tirer le livre vers le champ magnétique de la polémique. Ce livre s'inscrit dans une œuvre. A.M Homes a donné suffisamment de preuves de son engagement en tant qu'écrivain pur et dur pour que ce livre ne soit pas un accident, un coup, donc ça procède véritablement de son habitus d'écrivain, de sa manière de considérer le monde, ça procède aussi de son désir d'interroger, c'est frontal. Par rapport au monde. Donc c'est justement cette audace, ce courage, mais que la littérature prend en charge et qu'elle illustre à la perfection avec ce travail-là. Il y a un personnage de pédophile sympathique dans la famille royale de William Wellman. Et c'est drôle parce que j'ai publié le livre de William Wellman avant, et il y a parmi cette galaxie de personnages dans ce livre énorme, démesuré comme toute l'œuvre alors lui aussi de Wellman. Ce personnage-là fait partie de ces êtres, ça se passe dans le milieu de la prostitution à San Francisco, il est là parmi des figures de la dépravation, de la vénalité, de la défonce, enfin de ce milieu interlope, il court des miracles en tout genre, etc., du Tenderloin, là, du quartier de San Francisco. Et c'est très étonnant, parce que moi c'est un personnage que j'ai en tête depuis, enfin que j'ai bien gardé en mémoire, et quand j'ai découvert le livre d'Amy, c'était à pas tellement de distance, Et je me suis dit, tiens, voilà, voilà la famille, tiens, voilà ces types et la famille de ces personnages, la famille de ce type d'écrivain. C'est ce même... et c'est ça qui fait véritablement, pour moi, l'essence même, ou la quintessence de la littérature en tant que mission. Absolument, et c'est à la fois volontaire, puisque des choix sont faits, et involontaire. Ce que disait Hubert Nissen, le fondateur d'Actes Sud, finalement, les livres arrivaient, enfin, éditeurs interposent, et directeurs de collection interposent, des sensibilités, bon, une espèce de cohabitation, puis qu'à un moment donné, on voyait se dessiner une physionomie du catalogue. Et ben, c'est ce qui arrive au niveau aussi d'une collection ou du travail d'un simple éditeur, enfin je veux dire individuel. C'est effectivement bon, un parcours où il n'y a pas de hasard, quoi. Il y a des coïncidences, elles aussi troublantes, ou un tropisme, ou une recherche que viennent combler ou assouvir les œuvres de tels écrivains plutôt que de tels autres, oui. Donc tous les livres doivent se ressembler, mais ils doivent avoir tous cette même souveraineté, cette même nécessité. Du long de ce livre-là, il y a un dialogue, un échange extraordinaire de pulsions, il y a du masque et du dévoilement, de la transgression et de la provocation. Il y a de la haine. Il y a le spectre total d'une sorte de comédie à quelques personnes, mais dont les enjeux sont bien plus universels que la seule problématique de la pédophilie. Ça n'appelle pas le jugement, ça appelle l'interaction. On est constamment ballotté entre adhésion et distance, et c'est dans ce mouvement que la lecture est agissante en fait, parce que justement on se sent non pas manipulé mais transformé, déplacé, piégé ce texte, en entrant en empathie, dans une espèce d'adhésion qu'on ne reconnaît pas comme sienne au début, et pourtant qu'on est bien obligé d'entériner, puisqu'on continue et qu'on est dans une sorte de fascination. Et on est en même temps, moi je l'ai lu comme ça, enfin dans cet état à la fois d'adhésion et de fascination, et en même temps toujours avec un léger décalage permis par l'écriture, parce qu'elle n'est pas une écriture de racolage. Et les personnages ne sont pas du tout sympathiques. Ça aussi c'est fort, de ne pas céder à la tentation d'habiller les personnages de quelques vêtements qui les permettra au lecteur de les apprivoiser. C'est sauvage, c'est wild, c'est nu. Donc c'est comme une façon de prendre de se confronter à des sujets qui nous habitent et qui nous hantent, sans aucune concession, mais en même temps et sans aucune complaisance. C'est ça qui est fort, parce que c'est pas, quelle que soit la violence des scènes et leur caractère, alors on l'a mis en 4e de couverture pour se prémunir quand même, parce qu'on a eu peur aussi, on a mis, voilà, dont certaines scènes pourront choquer tel ou tel lecteur. On n'allait quand même pas mettre ce livre sous blister avec attention, interdit au moins 2, etc. C'est un livre toxique, oui, il est toxique. Et bon, moi je pense aussi que la littérature, elle peut être, et peut-être doit être toxique. Oui, il y a une fierté d'être dans ce compagnonnage, de défendre quelque chose. C'est un sport de combat aussi.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, that's why you
yes,
wrote that.
absolutely, yeah. And I think what's fun too as a writer, regardless of how difficult the subject matter is that you are part of a very big world of literary history, and you want to acknowledge those things and have fun with them. I mean, that's, you know, as a writer, that's part of the pleasure of it. One of the big references, obviously, to this book is Nabokov's Lolita. And part of what prompted me to write it was I was in a cafe and I overheard two people talking, and one of them was saying, oh no, Humbert didn't really sleep with Lolita. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. How could you read the book and think that? And it was her unwillingness to accept what's right there on the page. And I was thinking about the difference between that book being published at the late 1950s, early 1960s, and moving forward to, you know, 1995, which is already a long time ago, and how literature and culture has changed. So I wanted to represent, in a way, the directness of modern culture. And one comparison I always had was, you know, it was the music of Buddy Holly and very lovely, sweet music when Lolita was published, and then now we have Metallica and Nine Inch Nails. So I was curious about the literary equivalent of that. I wanted the book to be, I don't want to say aggressive exactly, but I wanted there to be no way to read it and pretend that these things weren't happening. Well, and he has a very distinct way of speaking, and he's very, I was going to say, language-based, and as was Nabokov. I mean, I think that what's interesting is that Lolita was the first book that Nabokov wrote in English, which is amazing, really, for somebody who grew up, you know, speaking Russian and everything else. But, so yes, I wanted to sort of, you know, play with that idea. I love to write, and I love to create characters. And I would say, as much as this man was the most disturbing character I've ever spent years with, he was also in many ways the most interesting. We talk about how this happens, and that we talk about there being these cycles of abuse. And the fact is that and I did a lot of research before I even started to write it, but the majority of people who take advantage of children were taken advantage of. And it becomes a reenactment of these sort of very confusing sort of, you know, attacks in a way. And often they are, you know, children are abused by people who they love, and by family and parents and people in their community. So I think it's a very complicated world, and I wanted to begin to kind of talk about that. But importantly, it's not a textbook. It's not a you know, a psychological book in the sense of what to do about this. It's a book to say, this is a real issue, and we don't talk about it well. Interestingly, they now use the book to train psychiatrists and psychologists, because they say that it's very difficult to find a representation of the personality involved, and that they feel like I captured it so well, which is sort of a compliment, but it's a complicated one. People always, you know, talk about me, so she's this shocking novelist and transgressive. And I think most important to me is to write about emotion, to give language to emotions that we find very hard to talk about. And my rule for myself always is, if I frighten myself while I'm writing, which this book was very upsetting to write, I won't let that stop me from doing it. I will deal with that upset and that fear. When I finished The End of Alice, I felt incredibly dark and awful. I mean, I felt, you know, I remember I was doing research, and I was in a library reading, and I would just start crying because I just felt so upset, honestly, by the subject matter. But, you know, that's okay. I mean, I also think intellectually and creatively, it was the hardest book I've ever written, but in many ways I think it's one of the best, because of the combination of ideas and language and the unfolding of this story. As the character realizes how awful his crimes are, he becomes more insane because what he realizes is unbearable for him. So he literally needs to depart reality because to know what he's done is, you know, unbearable. Well, I think it's an interesting question because I think on the one hand, there is, in the language of it, something kind of fantastical. And then literally as the book progresses, and this was, it's funny to say, I always say this took an extra year to do, because as the story goes on and the pedophile narrator is in some ways confronted, both because he exchanges letters with this young girl, but also as his story unfolds, with his crimes, he literally can't handle it. And so he spins further out of control, and in those ways the story becomes much more, you know, fantastical and less realistic and calls into question what really happened. But I think what happens is that he's losing his mind, that it is, the more he kind of, as I literally say, comes to consciousness and knows about how awful what he's done is, the more he goes crazy because he can't bear it. And so that's a turn in the book that was very hard to do, because you think on just a level of writing, the more somebody knows, the crazier they get, which is a hard sort of thing. So that was, as a writer, was very interesting for me. But I also think there is that quality that we often have, which is, you know, we have the modern word for it is denial. So we don't want to know what we already know. And I think that's really one of the big ideas of this book, that we as a society don't want to know what we already know. And the end of Alice makes it inescapable. You cannot excuse yourself from knowing what you know, which is part of why people have such a strong reaction to the book. And I think that's okay. I mean, there's nothing, when people say to me, "Oh, I loved your book," I think, "Oh my God, that's terrifying," because it's not a book that one is meant to love. I think it actually scares me when, or people will say, "I think we have something in common," and I think we really don't. I think that surprises people a lot, and I think it was interesting even in the United States when we were first trying to sell the book. A lot of the publishers were worried that somehow this was a true story and that I had been horribly abused. And I would go around to the publishing houses because they all wanted to meet me and to make sure that, you know, they weren't going to send me on tour and have me just go crazy. And I think, you know, a couple things. One is that I really am a fiction writer, and I work very hard to try to understand characters and write them who are profoundly different from myself. That's, as a fiction writer, regardless of what the subject is, that's the most fun and that's the hardest part. So there's that piece of it. But I also think that, you know, I had a teacher named Grace Paley who was a short story writer, and you wanted, as she would say, you want to tell the truth according to the character. And in a way that has nothing to do with you as a writer and what you believe and what's accurate for the person you're writing about. So I'm always trying to do that. Wanted that person to be, in some ways, whoever the reader decided they were. In the same way that I always like book covers that aren't very clear in who they're representing, because I don't want people to think, oh, that's the character. I want people to create this character for themselves. And I think that's one of the scary things about it, too, because as a reader, it is what you bring to it. And in this book, with these very dark themes and these very frightening themes, the question still becomes, what do you bring to it? I think jail is a complicated idea. I mean, I think obviously people who are dangerous to society shouldn't be walking the streets, but I also think jails are very expensive to run, and I understand that they should be a punishment, but I also think that while people are in jail, they should be educated, they should be trained to do jobs, because the majority of people do get out of jail, and then if they have no skills and no education, it just becomes a thing that repeats itself. So The truth is, what I would like to see as jails would be, you know, farms, organic, you know, where people are growing food, where people are learning how to make something, so that the jail, I mean, I would, you know, I could be very radical and say the jail should support itself. It should grow food and be able to sell that food, or make something and be able to sell that thing to cover the costs of what it means to be in jail. You shouldn't just go to jail and sit there, because it doesn't benefit anybody. I think that the thing is that one shouldn't romanticize criminal culture. You know, we look at Bonnie and Clyde, or what we call different anti-heroes, and I think there's a lot of danger in that too, in people identifying with criminals in some way. But also, I think the other piece of it is that we certainly see in the way that certainly in the United States, the news consumes what I would say these stories of just horrible things happening to people, and we feed on them. And I think, what are we eating? And what does that do to us? If this is what we take in, and these are the stories that we want to see, and I see it, you know, I look on the internet, you know, all day long, and the stories that are most popular are kind of horrible stories of things happening to people. And I think, again, to what end do we need to consume this as a kind of like emotional or sociological food? The whole thing was really hard to find language to describe these things that, on the one hand, are not familiar to me at all, but how to describe them in the ways that were accurate to the characters. And I also feel like in some way that the main narrator in this story is always pushing at our limits. So as soon as we think he's gone as far as he could possibly go and upset us as much as he possibly could, he goes further. But that's part of literally what he is trying to do to us as a reader, but it's also, I think, what is happening in society. That we always, you know, the edges of what we think is either acceptable or upsetting just keep getting pushed a little further out. And I think we see it, you know, even when this book first came out in the U.S., we didn't really have reality TV. And now we have all this reality TV where people act out horrible, crazy things, whether it's, you know, I'll get in a pit of snakes because I want to overcome my fear, or families that don't get along at all, but they're going to go on TV. I mean, what are we doing? And so it's the same sense of escalation that actually worries me. I don't think I would write a dark, I think it's as dark and violent as it could possibly get. I don't think I could do more. I think, and it's interesting, that the novel that I just wrote that came out this fall called May We Be Forgiven has a good piece of it that's about the internet and about a man who starts having these affairs with women he meets on the internet. And I don't usually write so specifically about modern culture or technology, because I think, oh, I don't want to like have it date a book. But in the new novel, there's a lot about that, because I think it's actually changed us in lots of ways. And I guess the first of those ways is that people have developed personas, so fractured off pieces of themselves that are sort of their internet personality. And somehow that has allowed them to do things or be people that they would not be in their real lives. And I think that as people is very confusing for us, and we start to lose a sense of what the borders of that are. And a lot of that does play out on the internet in the sexual area. So people, whether it's people chatting, people looking at pornography, people meeting people to, as we say, hook up in various ways that never would have happened before, and have proven sometimes to be quite dangerous, because you don't really know who you're meeting, and you don't really know who you're engaging with. So I think that piece of it, that would be a very different book, and I'm glad in a way that I wrote this before that, because this seems to me both in literary terms, a much more old-fashioned book because of the use of letters, which is, you know, we just have email now. We wouldn't have that. And I think what is true is that people in email and in these chats go further. And I think that's part of what you're getting at. Would it be darker, more violent? I think it's a really disturbing thing, because I think sometimes people don't realize the degree to which they have literally fractured within themselves. So it's interesting. And I don't know yet how that will play out. You know, it would be interesting maybe for me to write a short story that explores a person who on the one hand is leading a very functional life, and on the other hand, within that, there's some piece that's in a whole entire other world where he or she really lives as some other person. We see that too when people talk about their avatars, or we have lots of games now that do that too. And I think on the on a larger level, it speaks to the fact that we are not always one integrated person. We have many different aspects of ourselves. It tends to be the parts that we feel the need to keep secret or repressed or that we're ashamed of in some ways. We so often judge a book or say, oh, I love that book. Not every book is meant to be loved. It's a very contemporary idea. People will say, about other books or ask me, but just in general about literature. Well, and even when teaching writing, because I teach, people say, well, I don't like that character, and I think, who cares? It's when you think of Dostoevsky, do you think I like those characters? No. In the history of literature, there's the likability, which is such a modern and probably Hollywood concept. I have to like somebody. No, you don't. There were a lot of things in the news when I was just starting to write the book. And in the U.S., we had a big controversy with a Robert Mapplethorpe art show. And people were saying, oh, this work is pornographic, or this work can't be shown. And I thought that was interesting. And then we had Madonna published her book of sex photographs, and I was surprised by how not sexy they were. And then all kinds of sort of things coming together. And in the U.S. government, there was a time when Jesse Helms was this very conservative senator, was shutting down all kinds of arts programs. So I kept thinking about that, and I kept thinking about, I think one of the roles of literature is to talk about what we don't want to otherwise talk about. I don't think it's enough to just write books that are pretty or entertaining or, light. Life is so short, I can't be bothered with what's not significant, really. I don't think we all have the desire to have relationships with children, but I think we all have a more complex sort of fantasy life and elements of kinds of darkness, or whatever you want to call them, or perversions. It was important for this man in jail to literally confronts the reader. And that's always the part where I describe people, they might throw the book across the room because it's you don't expect the characters to come out of the novel and say, hey, what are you doing while you're reading this? Or how does this make you feel? And that's very intense. On a literary level, I like that I did that, and I like that it works, and it is so terrifying. And as a reader, I think it's really a challenge. I want you to bring your own values to this, which is really scary for people, by the way. I want you to bring your sense of right and wrong and where those edges and limits are. And everybody has different ones. But that's the challenge. If something provokes, that kind of a response, it is because it touches a nerve. And that to me means I've done my job. And it's not that I'm looking to shock people, but shock means you had a reaction to it. It doesn't just mean, oh, I thought nothing of it. And even if people say, I hate this book, I think that is a response to it. There's no wrong response to it. Do you know what I mean? To not like it isn't necessarily a negative, because why would you like it? Do you know what I mean? Except to admire it for the ways in which it does this. The character is not a likable character. It's not a pleasant story. After the end of Alice, I have never written since then another book as dark. For Torching has some, it's very interesting because we look at all these school shootings and complicated things around the world, and that's actually in that book, which is again very much about society. But I think the job of a fiction writer is to reflect the world back to us in a way that allows us to see ourselves differently. And I think it's not just a job of being funny or entertaining, although I think it's important that books have those qualities. it shouldn't be a punishment to read them. It should be a pleasure to read them. But I want to write books that have an effect on people. I mean, why bother otherwise? I would certainly say I was questioning my own limits as a writer and really was forced to, not just on a moral level, but on an artistic level and on a level of writing, I had to learn a lot, actually, to write this book. The reasons we read fiction and write fiction are definitely to spend time in a world other than our own.